This video is brought to you by juicd.energy. More than energy. Guns. They look cool. They sound cool. Hell, they are cool. When you look at a gun, you only focus on most of these things. How it feels, the recoil, the reload, and the sound it gives off. Not much goes into a person's mind when playing any form of shooters of how does the gun actually work. Most of the time, there's not too much to care. In this case, Destiny 2, and a series for being well over 7 years, and all the guns it showcases. A lot of people just don't really seem to care, but what of the people who do care? How do these guns actually work if they were to put into real life standards? Does it add up, or is it video game logic where bullet goes in gun and then bang? I also do want to point out that all these guns are set in the futuristic setting, which may get us a bit creative on a lot of things. And before we get started, I just want to point out that not all this information may be correct, and that these are just theories. The guns, ammunition types, or even general ballistics are just assumptions and guesses of the real world comparisons. I also want to point out that we are going off PvP charts opposed to PvE, as the numbers were a bit more consistent. There will be timestamps if you want to skip to your preferred weapon type, or you can start to watch here, because there is a lot to talk about.
Let's start with something simple. The first kind of weapon you get is a new light, and that of course would be the automatic rifles. Destiny 2's ARs bear quite a large resemblance to the rifles of today, both visually and functionally. It's easy to see an obvious design reference to the AK variant of rifles in the Seraph, Carbine, Gnawing Hunger, and Skaithlock. American rifles such as the M4 and M416 are also represented in-game through the likes of the Halfdan D, Forward Path, and Kvostov 7G. But what about the other weapons that don't fall into those two categories, such as the Summoner or the Shadow Prince? Well, those appear to look the most similar to the Beretta ARX 160 or even the G36, courtesy of the groove present on them. Now, despite Bungie adding all of these parallels to real-world counterparts into the ARs, ammo simply could not exist within Destiny 2 as it does in real life. For those who have never played Destiny, each gun has an intrinsic trait that determines how it operates overall. These traits, which can also be called archetypes or frames, are as follows: high impact, precision, lightweight, aggressive, adaptive, and rapid fire. ARs can be any of these except lightweight and aggressive. Each of these archetypes affect the impact, stability, fire rate, and overall benefits of each gun, but most importantly in this case, the ammo types. With this in mind, we have to exercise plausible deniability, for the same kind of gun being heavily modified to account for different types of ammo is not something that could happen outside of fiction. Assuming that we've done all our research right concerning damage output and general ballistics, here's the ammo cartridges that each frame is most likely to use. High impact should fire a 7.62 by 39mm as seen in AK-47s and the Type model of rifles. Precisions must utilize the oddly uncommon 300 AAC Blackout, due to having a similar ballistic to a high impact while maintaining the control of 5.56mm NATOs. Adaptive should fire the standard 5.56 by 45mm seen in most military rifles like the M4 or the M16, and rapid fires would have to use the 9 by 39mm from the AS Val. Back to the ARs themselves. While most do seem logical on paper, we're not counting the Viced Valkyrdine and the Chroma Rush, which use a box magazine similar to a P90. We're also excluding other rapid fires like the Reckless Oracle and the Steel Feather Repeater, as both of these use forms of traditional magazines. Then there's the Sweet Business, basically a minigun in AR form. If you've seen XenoGenic's previous video that overanalyzes Team Fortress 2's assortment of weapons, he explains how miniguns actually work. The Sweet Business, manufactured by Soros, would work as you'd expect a minigun would. Yet in this form factor, attempting to store 150 rounds into the cylindrical magazine would require the caliber size to be around the 9mm mark. Any larger and you'd start to encounter some issues. Don't even get us started on how this weapon actually works. It makes no sense. As much as we want to give up when discussing this weapon, we need to come up with the best possible theory for it. The only possible way that this weapon could operate is like so. For feeding ammo, a motorized belt will be required, which catches bullets and feeds them through the assembly of the barrel frame, similar to the chain and gear on a motorbike. And then to fire those bullets, there'd have to be a double action system to strike and reset the firing pin from the motor inside the weapon. If you perhaps don't know what a double action system is, it revolves around a firing assembly resetting after a trigger pull, as opposed to single action, which requires the hammer to be manually reset. Thankfully, the Sweet Business's ejection isn't too much of an issue, for the weapon uses a dispenser on the opposite side as opposed to catching the cartridge and ejecting it all together. It's all just space magic, and you'll probably be hearing about a lot more of it moving further into this video.
Pulse rifles are pretty much identical to auto rifles in general, but rather cases a bullpup in their design, which are taking reference to the Steyr AUG or even the TAR-21. The design itself is actually not overall hard to tell, since Bungie don't really use anything outside of the bullpup design for their pulse rifles, except for the Red Death back in Destiny 1. All pulse rifles fire in a burst mode, and again, these take rough similarity to auto rifles. So on screen now are the bullet types for each archetype that suits. But there is one more that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is the aggressive burst frames. For those who weren't aware, before Bungie sunsetted the majority of the fun weapons, the aggressive frames is a 4 burst shot pulse rifle that actually was really fun to use. There is one aggressive burst pulse rifle left in the game that has not been sunsetted, which can be obtained from the Garden of Salvation, the Sacred Provenance. But other aggressive burst pulse rifle frames like the Blast Furnace and Go Figure also had this trait. And this was extremely difficult to assume that what was the actual bullet, and we came to the conclusion that it was a 5.56 by 45mm NATO cartridge. But hold on, isn't the lightweight pulse rifle just the exact same ammo type in the case? And I thought so too, until I had to research that both of these bullets are very identical, but they don't actually work in the exact same way. The 5.56 by 45mm is referred to as a 223, while the 5.56mm NATO cartridge is just labelled as it is. According to an article on Quora on the difference between these two bullets, externally, there is no difference between the 223 Remington or the 5.56mm NATO cartridge or its brass case. However, the 5.56 NATO is loaded onto somewhat higher chamber pressures than the 223 Remington. This becomes important because rifle chambers for the 5.56 NATO are significantly different than the commercial 223 Remington chambers. Due to the higher pressures in the 5.56 NATO ammo, the internal dimensions of the chamber throw and the space between the bullet in the cartridge and the start of the rifling is greater. This change helps to reduce moderate chamber pressures when firing. Because the chambers are externally identical, care should be taken to avoid using 5.56 NATOs in firearms marked as 223 Remingtons. The NATO round generates about 5000 psi of more pressure and could potentially damage the gun or user. And after all that, pulse rifles are given the same treatment as most rifles, which actually makes us wonder if scout rifles are identical in any given shape or form. Well,
Scout rifles are a semi-automatic weapon that still takes the design of a bullpup archetype. The rifle itself acts in the same way as a DMR, battle rifle, or even a sniper rifle. The inspiration for these weapons are adaptations of existing firearms. For example, the Servant Leader. This weapon is similar to the SKS or SVU. Another example is the Royal Chase and Randy's throwing knife. These two weapons look similar to the Walther WA-2000. However, this time around, we can use higher calibers, since these do pack more of a punch towards them and allow engagement at longer ranges. After the research, we concluded that aggressive frames would benefit the 6.5mm Creedmoor, granted if the scout rifle barrel is of a reasonable length, such as the transfiguration to allow the caliber to work at its full potential. Precision would have the .308 and lightweight would have the 6.72 by 51mm NATO. Rapid fires would be using the 5.56 by 45mm NATO, granted it takes the grain count of the projectile and gunpowder to be increased, allowing more kinetic force in the bullet on impact. While we're on the topic of scout rifles, most of the weapons that I've talked about use their real-world counterparts or design. Some scout rifles may have one of the most weirdest designs of a magazine and bullet feeding operation out there, such as weapons like the Scholar, Trusty, and for old fans, the Conspirator. These weapons operate with their magazine conflicting with the grip. This excludes the Contingency Plan, which uses the same design as the Chroma Rush. The feeding operation of a bullpup weapon usually requires a way for ammunition to catch, like on a normal weapon or the barrel of a shotgun. In the case with Destiny and its sci-fi setting, weapons like the Trusty actually have enough room to cycle a new casing, similar to a lever action, just considerably more modified and the use of Destiny's imagination. Same goes with the Conspirator, as this again would require the catch of a lever action to cycle a casing into the chamber of the bullet. On pen and paper, it's the closest thing of a weapon to operate. As far as the Aurum or energy-based weapons go, that's all science stuff, which I'm not going to get involved with, but to say sell energy-based charges is like having a battery in a gun. Speaking of energy, today's video is brought to you by Juiced, Australia's #1 gaming energy supplement. Have you ever needed more of a kick or feel the crash that other energy drinks give off? Juiced helps you stay focused and helps you when you need it. Whether that be make a 5,000 word script about guns in Trials of Osiris, or more something that doesn't spike your blood sugar, Juice contains 0 sugar and comes in many flavors, including 2 new just released flavors, Bubble Beam and Sucker Punch. And if you use my code COOKIE in your next order on any product today, you'll receive 10% off your purchase. On top of that,
Ash, what are you doing? Are you self-promoting on my channel? But yeah, go to Juiced Energy for your next lot of energy supplements. Juiced, more than energy. Hey Ash, can I have some? I see. Maybe something a little bit different and a little bit easier, and something everyone can relate to. Handcannons, the name says it all. Literally handguns with the power to drop its target with extreme prejudice. And honestly, these were a little bit easier. Most of the handcannons in Destiny today operate to most double action revolvers and take reference to most magnums, such as the 44 Magnum, Colt Anaconda, or even the Mateba Auto Revolver, which is identical to the Seraph Service Revolver. Loading the handcannons in Destiny all use a magazine cylinder, similar to how normal cylinders on a revolver works. But instead of using a speed loader or even feeding the bullets individually, these bullets eject with a smaller cylinder which is then reloaded into a new magazine cylinder containing the new set of bullets. Igneous Hammer, Ace of Spades, or even Dire Promise eject with this cylinder, then are reloaded, shown in the gameplay. However, Sturm is the only handcannon that doesn't use this cylinder and instead uses a front-loaded magazine, which is not traditional in most handguns, and instead uses the design of something similar of a Tech 9. The firing mechanism on these handcannons, except the Sturm, would all be double action. Double action works on each trigger pull, lifting the hammer, and then releasing it when fully pulled, striking the pin. The reset on the hammer actually works when the trigger goes back to its original position, which grabs the hammer assembly once again. The only other action on another handcannon is from the last word, which uses a single action, which actually requires the hammer to be manually reset on each shot, hence why the game fans the last word. As far as ammunition in these handcannons go, it seems quite simple that most of these handcannons come with a distinct impact and fire rate on the weapons. High impact would load the 44 Magnum opposed to something like the 500 S&W or the 50 Action Express, which may offer increased velocity, but 44 Magnums do offer more stopping power on impact at the shorter ranges, and get less effective at longer ranges. A 357 would be used in adaptive frames to allow a balance of impact and stability in the weapon itself, and the 38 Special in the rapid fires due to their low impact and low recoil form of design. Weapons like Maleficence, Lumina, and Thorn all use their energy form of based firing, except for Thorn, which is, well, a big thorn. And in terms of Ariana's Vow, well, this was very interesting to try to figure out. The weapon itself has maximum impact and maximum range, so this should be a no-brainer to think Ariana's Vow would fire something as lethal as a 50 Action Express, only due to the sheer power of the gun and what it delivers, and the fact they both give off a massive kick and are able to deliver devastating blows with a loaded cartridge. Well, sadly, you'd be thinking wrong. We have to take into fact the ammunition perk of accurized rounds, which in the game allows additional range from weapons. Take this into the fact that it has a maximum range stat, and we can say that it uses the 500 Smith & Wesson Magnum at higher ground counts, and the sheer amount of gunpowder which gives off the higher muzzle velocity and the energy. Ariana's Vow is still like any other handcannon today. Ah yes, Sidearms, the weapon that literally gets no love whatsoever in the Destiny community, mainly because there are better things to use than sidearms. Anywho, sidearms do have a bunch of interesting frames and firing modes on them. Most of them have a generic design on their slides and grips and even overall frames. Most of the arcade type of weapons take their resemblance from either Glocks or Walthers, while some of the other weapons such as the 11th Hour or Buzzard take their resemblance from H&K, HK-45, which are pretty standard weapons that you see in video games or movies. But some of the other sidearms which you don't see much of, like the Drang is modelled after Schwarzschuss, model 1898, or even the Peace Bond which bears a resemblance to the Sieg P230, in all reality, pretty standard stuff. And most of these weapons operate as intended, except for the Aurum weapons using the whole battery cell type of energy, which I'm no scientist, but yeah, future stuff. Sidearms in Destiny work as what you expect of the real world counterparts or in any other game. The magazine goes into the grip, pull the slide back, and fire. In terms of what guns actually would use was a little bit tricky, only because pistols do seem to use a lot of different cartridges with some certain firearms, and that they allow compatibility with rimfire opposed to centerfire. Precisions would benefit the 40 Smith & Wesson, a simple and heavy cartridge which is best suited on how their archetype works overall. Adaptives would load the 45 ACP, and the lightweight and aggressive burst would load the 9mm, due to the fact that both of these weapons have the same damage in-game. Adaptive burst and the Suro's rapid fire would both use use the 380 ACP, both again using different grain counts for their velocity and energy. Then you have weapons like the Kinesthesia 7K, which generates a stasis shot, or the Devil's Room, which fires a beam on charge, don't work as intended as any other sidearm, as these would work with something of, say, per a cell, similar to a battery and advice. To be real, we don't know much about this without breaking some fourth walls. SMGs are really just automatic pistols in a nutshell when you think about it. Both use identical calibers and pretty much operate as a rifle. Now you think most of these weapons act and fire similarly of say something like an MP7, P90 or an Uzi, and you wouldn't be wrong. Most of the SMG reloads involve the magazine coming out of the grip followed by pulling the back on the bolt on top of the weapon. The other SMGs such as Death Adder or Recluse do use something similar to say a P90 with its box magazine. And since we've only got 3 archetype of weapons, it's pretty much simple to straightforward to say that the Precisions would use the 9mm Parabellum, Aggressives would use the H&K 4.6x30mm, and the Lightweights would use 5.7x28mm. And honestly, this was very interesting to research, as again, Australia being starved of firearms. A lot of people who believe that the 5.7x28mm would have been more precision choice, you'd be sadly wrong, as going off ballistic charts, the 9mm does sport more muzzle velocity and energy right off the bat. As far as the penetration goes, the 5.7x28 or even the HK 4.6x30mm sport more armor penetration opposed to the 9mm. Armor penetration focus on what it was designed for and does that job. It loses its velocity after penetration once the layer has been breached, which is why it came out short on top. However, we have to remember that we are dealing with shields opposed to some form of Kevlar plated vest in the real world, which is really the only limited information and comparison we have.
I know what you're thinking, and you know this. You know what a shotgun is. It's simple, as there's only 2 types of shotguns. Magazine-based, like Duality and Lord of Wolves, and every other shotgun that uses a pump or a lever or benefits a semi-automatic. It's not that hard. Duality would use the double action mechanism from revolvers as far as how it fires from pellets to slug. We can only assume this has to do with how the shell works, since when aiming down the sight, these valves actually shape with the gun itself, putting it down to some form of furnace in the shotgun. And since Lord of Wolves fires 5 shots at a time unless you unleash the wolves, which shoots 10, this would work, as per cartridge shown in the magazine of the weapon has a form of propellant or energy-based cell. Finding what shells fire from the other normal shotguns wasn't that hard either. All shotguns besides Chaperone, Lord of Wolves, Duality, or even Tractor Cannon uses a pump action method to cycle the next shell, which is generic on any shotgun in a game or real life, and even the feeding of these shells is pretty self-explanatory. The shells get fed into the tube, then are caught and fed through ready to fire. If we're going to go off of the generic shotgun in a video game, buckshot would be loaded for pellet shotguns and 12-gauge slugs for precision-based shotguns like Chaperone and Heritage. As far as what shells go into the lightweight and precision bullet shotguns, which, well really, I'm no expert on this, but the increase of gunpowder would be in the mix of all of this. So really it's pretty straightforward, or is it? Like every type of cartridge for rifles or pistols, shells also have a type of shell size. These all really determine on the actual tube diameter and what is compatible with each firearm. In this case, weapons like Fellwinter's Lie and Sudden Death would benefit the 10-gauge shells due to the shell's compatibility with thicker pellets. Same goes with the rapid fire using 20-gauge for the same reason, which all comes down to pellet size. Speaking of rapid fires, most rapid fires in the game don't make use of the pump until its animation is played long enough, and it's seen on all rapids pump after each shot. Which, this may not seem logical, but this is an actual firing mechanism presented in the Spaz 12. But as far as the Fourth Horseman goes with this design and how it works, I've got no idea how 5 shells fit into 4 barrels while being fed underneath. I'm just going to leave this one as it just does. Maybe it took some notes from the lock and load.
Snipers in Destiny 2 should be no surprise on how simple their design and overall operation works. All sniper rifles in games are semi-automatic and use the exact form of mechanism of a rifle. The weapons itself are pretty generic and take more reference to most military rifles, such as the Hake weapons taking its appearance to either the SR-338 or the MK12. And then other weapons such as the Shepherd's Watch, which take its appearance after Sastava M91 rather than the Dragunov, and then you have bigger sniper rifles such as the Frozen Orbit after the AS-50. However, weapons like the Esposte or the Widow's Bite again use a box magazine similar on a P90. Ammo feed is pretty self-explained, as we've discussed this many times this video. As far as what we can expect what weapons to fire, it came down to some really easy choices. Rapid fires would benefit the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, mainly due to the fact that this works with machine guns and is less likely to jam. Adaptives would use the 308 due to them being common on either hunting rifles or rifle cartridges in general, and then to aggressives, which would use the 338 Looper. Then we do have one more weapon which has more damage and more range output, and that is the Whisper of the Worm. The Whisper of the Worm is classified as a heavy sniper rifle and shares no similar traits of any other sniper rifle besides its fire rate of high impacts. This would have to put the Whisper of the Worm as a 408 Chaytak, which is used in sniper rifles such as the M200 Intervention or the SRR-61. Alternatively, a 50 cal probably would have been a more of an appropriate choice. However, we found the magazine itself is smaller and would not be compatible of that firing of that cartridge. So we went with something similar and that was a bit smaller and still generates a lot of energy to it. Despite that, a weapon such as Izanagi's Burden, the ammo type would have to be a matter of a custom tooled bullet that can merge into one. Its ability Hone Edge, which allows you to consume the whole magazine into one powerful shot, is a bit of a tricky one. There is no information on how any of these guns would work if they were put into a real-life setting, let alone if anyone has attempted to even make one. Fusion rifles, according to the Destiny Grimoire, are advanced energy disbursement weapons gained throughout the discovery of the Golden Age research. This weapon comes as a fusion rifle. Users must hold down the trigger for a few moments to charge the weapon before firing. By that sentence alone, and from the weapon itself, it's considered to be a charged base and fired on release. The ammunition perks themselves gives us a bit of an idea on how they all operate and to get the weapon to fire, such as a battery to generate power and to operate as a magazine. Coils, which generate the power from the battery to increase or generate its power. A fuse to allow store energy to be distributed upon its fire, and a repeater to release the bolts when the weapon is fired. On pen and paper, linear fusion, fusion rifles, and trace rifles are literally a power supply that can fire a bolt of energy. As far as how these types would actually fire their bolt, I'm no scientist when saying this. Fusion rifles such as Null Composure or Plug 1 would have to operate with low capacity coils to store each single bolt on each shot. Linear would do the same, but would have a single coil that can generate a massive amount of capacity when fired that can deliver a high velocity bolt. And trace rifles would seem to operate as a normal use of a battery. When used, the power is transferred to the coils and then released to keep maintained rather at a capacity. These could be the fact that how the magazine sizes on all these weapons are different, and how the fusion rifle have bigger magazines opposed to the linears having a smaller one and don't require a lot to operate. I'm not going to lie here because I know nothing about explosives aside from video games or movies, but with that we will go off the best as we can. To start with breech loading grenade launchers, they operate similarly to the M79 or the Milcore stopper grenade launchers, which use a breech action style of operation like an under and over shotgun. Most of the design of the breech loading grenade launchers also take their design from the H&K M320 grenade launcher, which really isn't much to go off. However, the heavy grenade launchers are basic in their design and use the design similar to the Milcore MGL, but actually operates differently from what it's referencing. Opposed to the real-world grenade launchers using a release to break open the assembly and allow a reload, Destiny's method uses the exact opposite and shifts the assembly forward. Once it has been broken and shifted forward, the drum assembly is then ejected and reloaded with a brand new one, similar to how a revolver ejects the cylinder to the side when reloading, unless you reload the Colony, which uses a magazine, or the Prospector, which is a break action and loads a new drum. On top of what ammunition would be used on both of these grenade launchers, both deal the exact amount of damage, whether that would be on the splash or on impact, and it easily puts it down to a 40mm grenade, with different amounts of powder to increase its blast radius as seen on the perks. Then when we move on to rocket launchers, where things get a little bit more tricky. However, going off the very limited information that was supplied, weapons such as the Bad Omens or Code Duello takes the reference to the MK153 or the Small, which reloads the rocket from the back exhaust. As far as other rocket launchers like Heathen's Vengeance or Hothead that reloads from the top of a form of a breach-like operation, we couldn't find anything besides it working to the exact opposite of a front-loaded rocket launcher similar to the RPG-7. Now that we finally move on to machine guns, which is the last part of this video, not a lot of people tend to use these as there are better things to use such as swords or rocket launchers in PvE. However, in PvP they are a bit more commonly used only due to them being quite viable with the right rolls, and they can be very, very deadly. As far as all the machine guns go in Destiny 2, they operate the exact same as each other in terms of feeding and reloading shown in their animation. As far as the shape and form, all the machine guns take the reference to the FN Minim M249 or the M60. It's all pretty simple and straightforward, since Destiny doesn't have any other sort of machine guns that use a different form of operations aside anything from like an L85 or even an AUG, per to all being belt-fed and having a box-like magazine. This shouldn't be an issue as to see what bullets would actually be loaded into the weapons itself, as Destiny 2 doesn't offer a lot in machine guns. To start, rapid fires or the exotic Hera Parrot would fire 5.56mm NATO rounds purely as they deal the same damage as adaptive auto rifles. Adaptive MGs would use the Chinese 5.8x42mm seen in the QJB95s, and aggressives would use the 7.62x51mm NATO purely for the sake of the heavy cartridge and impact. Then we have one more weapon that doesn't fire traditional machine gun rounds, and you're probably all waiting for this, which is the Xenophage. The Xenophage's exotic trait fires pyrotoxin rounds, which fire a high explosive ammunition, and if we take into the fact that it's a maximum impact bullet, we'd have to go off with the obvious 50 caliber. But we also have to remember this is an explosive round, which puts us towards the Raufoss MK211, a high explosive round which is commonly used in the M2 Browning and in belt-fed machine guns, and having this on the Xenophage is definitely an exception. Hey look, someone decided to finally upload again. Thank you all so much for watching till the end of this video, and really it took me a fair bit longer than I actually imagined. I also want to thank Jack5, Cookie and PopTop89 for their video contribution, and I will be posting a link to their channels down below so you can check them out. I also want to give a huge shout out to juicd.energy for allowing me to mention their gaming energy supplement, and I would strongly recommend you checking them out with this link on screen. Again, you can use my friend Cookie's code to get up to 10% for your next purchase, and I can strongly recommend it if you want something that tastes good and refreshing and doesn't cause crash opposed to other energy drinks or other supplements. I recommend juice, plus coming to summer in Australia, it's perfect for it. On top of that, you can follow me on Twitter where you can keep up to date on anything and everything, and on Twitch where I stream from time to time, as well as you can join the community on Discord on XenoGenic Shack. Links are right here on screen. For now, I'm XenoGenic, and I'll see you in the next video.